Hello, everyone. My name is Deontay Marquis, and I will be presenting today's course to you, which is Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation. So, without much further ado, let's begin. So, today's objectives, we have about six objectives or things that I really want to accomplish, and I want you to leave here with an understanding of after going through today's course. The first of those objectives is by the end of this course, you will be able to define and know the difference between abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So, of course, if we're going to be learning about the three, they all have similar impact on the patient. And sometimes they even share similarities, but there are key differences between each of the three. And we're going to get deeper into what those are as to how they affect the patient and exactly what warrants abuse, what warrants neglect, and what warrants exploitation. Um, and really tear apart the connection so we can have a deep understanding of all three. Next, we're going to list and understand patient rights. So, by the end of this presentation, of course, I don't expect you to be able to list each of the patient rights that we're going to discuss, but you will be able to recognize, and hopefully, some of you may be able to list a few of those patients' rights, but more so understanding what those rights are and how they translate into our patients' everyday lives and what impact we as caregivers in the healthcare setting that you may work in has on those patients' rights. Because we want to make sure we're always protecting them and upholding them because they are set in place to protect the patient. So we want to make sure that we are honoring those rights because those are laws and we definitely don't want to break the law. Our third objective for today is to be able to recognize which patients are at the highest risk of being abused, neglected, and or exploited. Okay, so we're going to recognize which patient's characteristics places patient A at a higher risk of falling victim to abuse or being neglected in comparison to patient B. There's been studies that have found different characteristic traits, different types of diseases that a patient can have, different settings that a patient can be in that places one patient at a higher risk for falling victim to being abused and neglected than other patients. So we want to be able to recognize those characteristics so we can identify those patients and we can make sure we're keeping a keen eye on them to make sure that they aren't abused or exploited. Our next course objective for today uh, is to discuss the warning signs that may suggest an individual has suffered from or is currently suffering from abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Because, just like you and I, we're not always going to tell other people what's going on in our lives. Um, so we can't expect for patients to come to us and tell us if they're being abused or neglected or exploited. So as caregivers, we need to one know that the patients aren't always going to come and volunteer that information to us, and two, we need to be able to identify warning signs that suggest a specific individual is being abused so we can then go and talk to that patient and seek that information from them. Um, our next but not last course objective, you should, by the end of this course, be able to discuss the most common characteristics of an abuser. So we want to talk about what the victim looked like, what most common characteristics the victim or the patient uh, has that targets them as a patient, as a victim of abuse. And then we're also going to talk about the most common characteristics of the abuser, of the person who's taking advantage of the patient. So we want to have a profile of the patient that's most likely to be abused. And we also want to have a profile of the abuser the person who's most likely to be abusing our patient. So that way we can identify the person who's most at risk and also the person who's our number one suspect of putting that patient at uh, in harm's way. And last but not least, our course objective for today, you should be able to understand and put into practice different techniques or different techniques to prevent individuals from becoming victims to abuse, neglect, and or exploitation. All right, so let's begin. Oh, and at the end of all that, we'll have a quick quiz, 2-question quiz, just a review for you to test your knowledge and see how well you understood the information we went through today. So, as I like to start off each of my presentations, and first sharing with you why you're taking this course, why this information is important. Um, you might, what am I doing here? So, what are you doing here? You are here to learn about elderly abuse, exploitation, and why is this information important? Well, this information is important because as you can see in the graph here, the red line indicates the total proportion of the population that is age 65 and plus. So as you can see, in the early 1900s, it was a very small, insignificant portion of the population that was uh, that was 65 plus. But as we go forward in the years, the proportion of the population increases. So there's a significant aging population. As you may have already heard, the baby boomers generation is aging, and it's a vast number of individuals. So that Pacific age group is going to introduce a lot of nuances into the healthcare system. And this number of Americans aged 65 and older is going to more than double over the next 40 years. So that's huge. So by 2040, there's going to be over 80 million 65 plus individuals. And adults ages 85 and older, that's going to be the group who's going to need a significant amount of help, who's going to be at an increased risk for abuse. That number within the population is going to quadruple. So we're going to see a huge shift and demand for caregivers, and we're also going to see an opportunity for people who prey on individuals who need help. They're also going to have a huge opportunity because such a majority of the population is going to become more vulnerable as they enter into their later stages in life. So this is an alarming risk. That's why this is very important for us to be here today, learning about abuse and exploitation amongst the elderly, because approximately 1 in 10 Americans aged 60 and older have already experienced some form of elder abuse. So we can only imagine, given the information we just talked about with the population aging so rapidly and tremendously, how that number will elevate in the years to come, as there is an estimated 5 million elders who are abused every year, while only 1 of 24 abused elderly cases are reported. So not only does that statistic, 1 of 24 abused elderly, an alarming number, and just goes to show that there isn't enough opportunity or encouragement or education amongst the elderly and maybe even the staff members of reporting elderly abuse, recognizing elderly abuse, and taking measures to stop it. But it also is alarming because it demonstrates how many people who abuse elderly aren't caught, which only gives them more opportunity to continue taking advantage of the elderly and leaving more victims behind. So that is why this information is so important. So exactly what is elder abuse? What is abuse? Well, A general term definition for abuse is the physical, sexual, or psychological abuse. Now, abuse also includes neglect and abandonment and exploitation of an older person by someone else. So, abuse is more so an umbrella term that under it we can categorize neglect and abandonment and exploitation. But those all have separate specific meanings as well. And we're going to get to that in just a minute here. Now, abuse doesn't have to occur in any specific environment. It could be in a home, it could be in a care facility, it could be outside at the park, but it has to occur somewhere where there is an expectation of trust, or when an older person is specifically targeted because of their age or their known disability, which is why elderly inside of a healthcare facility or an assisted living facility are at such risk of being abused because there is indeed that expected level of trust um, from the facility that they're in, that they'll be kept safe, that there aren't any people there coming in and out who want to harm them, and also, it is recognized because this person is in an assisted facility that they have some type of disability that mandates or called for them to be placed in this facility. So it's recognized that yes, this person does have a disability and they aren't 100% functioning on their own, which lends opportunity for them to be preyed upon. Um, so to your right here, you see I just list out more specifically the different types of ways a person can be abused, whether it's physically, sexually, emotionally, financially, neglect by caregiver or abandonment by caregiver, or even if the patient self-neglects themselves, that can also be considered abuse. So this moves us along into what is neglect and what is abandonment. So I group these two together because they share similarities, but again, they have specific differences that we're going to get to here. So neglect is the failure of an individual or individuals who are responsible for a patient, whether it's a part or full. It's a failure of them to provide everything needed for that patient. So it could be food, it could be shelter, water, protection, healthcare, right? If we neglect a patient, neglect can be, neglect doesn't just have to be you stopped giving the patient their blood sugar medicine for a week. It could be you didn't give them their blood sugar medicine for the day, and that can be considered neglect, right? You neglected to provide uh, partially or fully the health care that they needed. Um, Signs of neglect include bed sores, poor hygiene, unexplained or unintentional weight loss, unexplained lapses in medication administration. So let's say for that day that the patient didn't receive their blood sugar medication, you have an explanation. Um, it can still be posed that that was an act of neglect if you don't have a good explanation as to why. Someone can make the allegation that that is neglectful behavior. So when we're taking care of the elderly and they're especially relying on us to provide things for them, we want to make sure that we're checking every box and we're taking care of them as best as we can and as best as one can assume that person would take care of themselves if they were 100% autonomous or independent, right? Um, in my experience, some of the most common signs of neglect, and you may share this thinking as well, but or experience as well. Some of the most common signs of neglect will be poor hygiene, um, unexplained weight loss, and dehydration and falls. So It can be one, it can be a collection of some. Um, it's always a very unique case. So it's best to always assess the patient, assess the environment that they're in or they're coming from, and keep in mind that patient's inabilities, their strengths, their weaknesses, and to make your uh, own judgment on what signs constitute neglect to you. Because sometimes, if the patient is very large and it's difficult to turn them, or they don't like to be turned, then we can suspect that bed sores will come just because of the patient's own lack of participation. But if the patient's very small and comes to the facility and is uh, under your care, always cooperates with turning and likes to turn and appreciates the turn, then if the patient had starts to develop a bed sore, then that's something that's abnormal in our experience for that patient. So it would be reasonable to presume that something changed, whether that be on the part of the patient or the part of the person responsible for turning the patient, and that would constitute some form of neglect. Abandonment. Abandonment is similar to neglect, except it's a complete termination of patient care without any type of notice that care will be discontinued. And this all occurs quickly before the patient even has an opportunity, or another healthcare worker has the opportunity to step in and provide the patient with the care that has just been removed or discontinued. So abandonment and neglect share the same signs, but of course, abandonment can lead to much more exaggerated signs of neglect because no one is there at all. Whereas in neglect, someone may be there, they may be missing a few steps, not checking all the boxes, but they're providing some elements of care, right? So we've talked about abuse, we've talked about abandonment, and we have talked about neglect. So let's talk about exploitation. What is exploitation? And if you see here, I also included misappropriation of property, which I'll get into in just a moment. But let's first begin with exploitation, which is taking advantage of residents for your own personal gain through any form of manipulation or intimidation, whether you're threatening them, telling them you're going to hurt them, or telling them you're going to hurt the family member. Now, when I say you, it doesn't just have to be you, the caregiver, or the person working in the facility close with the patient. It can also, all of these apply just as much to you, the caregiver, as they do to the patient's family members. So keep that in mind. As an example here will illustrate of exploitation, when you coerce or manipulate a resident or patient to sign documents, as in a will or a power of attorney. Sometimes situations that I found myself in while working in the healthcare is power of attorney, where family members, when elderly loved one becomes sick and hospitalized, they argue over who can become power of attorney. It's not always because the patient has some huge pile of money that that person or a member of the family wants to oversee. It's sometimes because the family members don't trust each other, or they have different relationships, or the patient has told each of them different things about how they want their end of life stages to proceed. So each of them has a different idea of what the patient wants, and the patient is not 100% of sound mind. So the patient isn't able to reconcile the differences between the family members. So there can be an argument about who will become the power of attorney. And you may see members of the family, when they're alone with the patient, exploiting the patient to get them to sign the POA and make that specific family member a POA. So whenever you're dealing with a will or a POA, you want to keep an eye out for that type of exploitation. Also, unknown charges to the resident's credit card. You want to make sure that you establish a relationship with your patient, not too intrusive, but you're talking to them and understanding how they're managing their finances or who's managing their finances for them, um, and help the resident understand what's going on with their finances so that if unknown charges to the credit card do begin to pop up, you've already established some type of communication with the residents about their finance so they can share that information with you. Um, and also withholding information from the patient about their finances. This may be done in good interest from some family members in specific situations, but this can also be exploitative behavior. So we need to keep an eye out for these types of behaviors, threatening the patient or trying to manipulate them in any kind of way. And misappropriation of property is it falls under exploitation, but its specific definition is a deliberate misplacement, exploitation, or wrongful temporary or permanent use of a resident's belongings or money without the resident's consent. So this would be if your resident is in living in the facility and they're unable to drive a car, but they have a car and they're telling you that someone is using their car, that they don't want to use the car. It may sound like a small trivial matter, but the patients have rights, as we will get into those rights. And although that may be the patient's son or daughter or husband, if they say they don't want that individual to use the car, then and the individual then uses the car, that is an example of misappropriation of property, which is a form of abuse, as such, exploitation to be specific. So, some more examples would be stealing or embezzling a resident's money or personal property, forging a resident's signature and attempting to cash a check, or, as we just talked about, using a resident's car without their permission. That is misappropriation of property. So I mentioned briefly what I mentioned briefly. Patients have rights, and in our court's objective, I said we are going to be talking about these patients' rights because it's important for us to have some idea of what they are and to be able to recognize them. And hopefully, you'll be able to list a few at the end of this. So, the Residences Bill of Rights. In 1987, Congress enacted the Nursing Home Reform Law, which was also then later incorporated into the Medicare and Medicaid regulations as rights that nursing homes, resident facilities, we have to abide by to make sure that residents, elderly residents, are being protected and are giving the same rights as you and I, um, living out into, and other people living out in society. And so basically, it's saying that even though these individuals are requiring additional assistance because of some disability or because of their old age, we still have to give them the same rights. So the nursing home reform law was drafted. So the first of these laws is the right to freedom from abuse, mistreatment, and neglect. So we've talked about abuse and neglect. This one's pretty straightforward. Patients should be treated just. The next is the right to freedom from physical restraints. We want to make sure that we are using all non-physical and non-pharmacological interventions to refrain from placing patients under physical restraints because it is one of their rights to be free from restraints. Um, that is what this right is about. It's not saying that we cannot place them under the restraints, but it is saying that they have a right to not be under restraints, to be free from restraints. So we want to make sure that you're following your facilities policies about restraints 100%. And if you're unfamiliar with them, I encourage you to become more familiar with your facilities restraint policies. Patients also have a right to privacy. Uh, in the beginning of my profession, when you're taking care of a patient and you're very involved in their care, sometimes you feel just as privileged to enter in their room to provide care for them as if it were your own, because this is your workspace and you're there to help them. But we have to recognize that these residents have a right to privacy. We have to knock. We have to wait to be acknowledged and then enter the room. They have a right to privacy. Next, the right to accommodation of medical, physical, psychological, and social needs. So, just as we talked about under abuse, we need to make sure that if we are responsible for the patient's health care, that they have a right to appropriate accommodation that will meet all of their medical needs, physical, psychological, and social. Um, Next, the right to participate in resident and family groups. So if there's a family meeting or if there is a meeting about residents and residents are allowed to this meeting, they have a right to participate. We need to make sure that we are making a specific scheduled meeting for the residents to participate if we're discussing their care or if there's discussion about the care inside the facility in general. The right to be treated with dignity, that's very straightforward. Dignity comes into question a lot in elderly care facilities. So I want to make sure that you guys understand that this is one of the patient's rights that was set forth under the nursing reform law. Also, the right to exercise self-determination. What does that mean? That means the patient has the say so has some say so in what goes on in their life, in their care, and how they're treated. They determine themselves how those things go, and they have a right to exercise that say so in their life. The right to communicate freely. Sometimes residents don't communicate in the best of language if they are upset. They have a right to be upset and they have a right to express themselves how they so please, as long as it's not uh, hurting you or hurting another resident. Residents also have the right to participate in the review of their care. So again, they have the right to participate and the right to exercise self-determination. So we need to give them the information so they can exercise that self-determination by allowing them to review their care plan and to be informed about changes in that care plan or general changes in the facility ahead of time so that they can think about what those changes mean for them and make a decision. And last but not least, they have a right to voice grievances without discrimination or reprisal. Reprisal being someone coming back at them for a grievance that they made. So those are our patient rights. Now, we're going to get more specific into who is at risk. What type of patient is at the highest risk? Well, the patient that would be at the highest risk of falling victim to some type of abuse would be individuals with low social support. So this would be the individual whose family has moved away, or the individual who doesn't have the best relationship or has no relationship with their family and doesn't seem to have someone that they can call and lean on and talk to. We all know that when you have good social support, you can overcome a lot of things. And unfortunately, as elderly patients, life happens, family moves on, whether they pass away or they live somewhere else or relationship have gone awry. Um, these individuals with low social support are placed at an increased risk of falling victim to the hands of abusers. Also, individuals with a low income or economic status. African Americans make up a large portion of the low income parts of the population in certain areas. So, being of African American ethnicity is also a risk factor, even though it's not listed here. Individuals with a functional impairment and or poor physical health. So as you can imagine, the more impaired an individual is, or the sicker they are, then the increased risk that someone will try and take advantage of them, because unfortunate to say, it's easier to take advantage of someone who's more impaired or sick. Women also, according to studies, appear to be more likely abused, or more likely to be abused, as opposed to their male counterparts. And last but not least, individuals suffering from dementia. Um, Individuals with dementia are at an increased risk just because of the general way that dementia affects the brain. It affects the way they behave. It places them at risk, and also because it's very common for people to question the validity of things that someone suffering from dementia has told them, because people from dementia sometimes have hallucinations or sometimes lose touch with reality. So we know that our abusee is likely to be female, low income, African American, diagnosed with dementia, and low social support. So now let's look a bit at what our abuser looks like. What are the characteristics of the abuser? The abuser is most commonly found to be adult children or a spouse of the patient. So someone closest to them is likely to be the abuser. And that abuser is most likely male. So the abusee is likely female, the abuser is likely male. In addition, characteristics which are common amongst the abuser include past or current substance abuse, having a mental or physical health condition, or both, some type of history or trouble with the law. So they've been arrested or placed on probation. They've been in trouble with the law before. This isn't their first time breaking the law. Um, they are socially isolated or withdrawn. So they're not very social. They're going to keep to themselves, or they're going to keep to their business, which is trying to abuse the resident in our facility. And most of the time, the reasons behind their abuse are because they're experiencing some type of major financial or life stressful event. They're going through something themselves. But just because they're going through something, it doesn't make it okay for them to put the same type of stress on someone else and to abuse an elderly while in the facility. So, just to illustrate more, because in researching this myself and learning about elderly abuse and exploitation, I found it very interesting that family members were the most common perpetrators. But then again, when I thought about it and my experiences in healthcare, I wasn't so surprised. So, this graph here demonstrates that 57.9% of family members are the most common perpetrators. And this information is from the NCEA in a study they did containing 4,156 older adults. So they found that well over half of those adults that were abused, family members were the most common perpetrators. Second, after that, as you can see represented by the orange pie, friends and neighbors were the second most common, representing 16.9%. And in third, home care aides, medical personnel were the third most likely abuser, which represented 14.9%. So again, just to stress, this presentation, even though it may seem like I'm addressing you, the healthcare worker working in a facility, it's important for us to I'm not targeting us. I'm trying to give us the information to recognize the family members who are the most common perpetrators, or the friends and neighbors, or even other healthcare aides and medical personnel that you work with. We're trying to familiarize ourselves with what the abusee looks like and what the abuser looks like, and also what are some warning signs of abuse, so we can first notice when someone is being abused, or that there is an increased risk that a person is likely to be abused, and then to take the correct protocol to report our suspected abuse. So, warning signs of abuse. Physical abuse is indeed the most common type of abuse, and it's important to be able to distinguish and recognize the physical signs of abuse, which are inconsistent with the care that a patient receives. So, just because we may see a wound or injury on the patient, we need to be able to distinguish and recognize the abnormal physical signs from those which are more common. Just like my example in the beginning of this lesson, where we talked about the pressure sore on a patient who we've come to know is very difficult to turn, who doesn't like to be turned, and classifying that as neglect, as opposed to the patient who is smaller and doesn't mind being turned, participates in being turned, and somehow, when we come back to care for them, has a terrible pressure sore on their back. Which one is more likely to be a victim of neglect? So the same concept of thinking applies here. We need to first recognize what's inconsistent with the care that the patient receives. We need to also identify what's out of normal for that particular patient. And last, we need to we need to see what coincides with the presence of a particular person. Watch the patient's behavior when a particular person comes around, or after a particular person leaves, whether it's family, a coworker, or someone else who works in the facility. Just begin to watch the patient's behavior before and after. So, what are some warning signs of physical abuse? Some warning signs of physical abuse would include welts, any type of wounds, injuries. These are all very obvious types of warning signs, but something a little more subtle: persistent physical pain and soreness. We're caring for the elderly patients. A lot of them have pain. A lot of us have pain who are not living in a care facility. So, that again, this brings me back to 1 and 2 on your left side here. What's inconsistent with that patient and what's out of normal for that patient. So, is this persistent pain or persistent soreness out of ordinary for the patient? Another more subtle warning sign would be nutrition and hydration issues. Is this patient suddenly not eating? Is this patient suddenly eating a lot more when we feed them? What's going on? What's changed, and why has it changed? Sleep disturbances. What's out of normal for this patient? What's inconsistent with the care that the patient receives? This patient always has no trouble sleeping. What's going on? Because that sleep disturbance is going to lead us to a stressor, and that stressor may just be because they got some bad news about a family member or their own health condition, or they're worrying about their finances, or that sleep disturbance may be that someone is abusing them, and that fear is keeping them up at night and keeping them from getting a good night's sleep. And last, exacerbation of pre-existing health conditions. If the patient is receiving overall great care from you and the rest of your staff, no other warning signs are present, but for some reason just starts you see an exacerbation of pre-existing health conditions. Let's say the patient has asthma and the asthma is consistently getting worse. Nothing new is going on. The patient isn't going for longer walks or shorter walks, it's the same time walk. What's going on? So these are all just little subtle clues that we need to look out for that may lead us to discovering that the patient is actually suffering from some type of abuse. Now, what can you do? The first thing we can do to help prevent uh, abuse from happening is to listen to older adults when they're discussing their interactions with family, with caregivers. And I'm not saying for you to eavesdrop, but just to listen because elderly patients, they do like to talk. But in my experience, they do like to talk a lot. And sometimes, as a caregiver, we don't have the time to sit and listen to everything they have to say. But if you found that your patient is at a higher risk, more vulnerable, or you have some suspicion that they may be being abused, then you want to make sure you take that extra time to listen to everything they have to say. Second, you want to believe what they're telling you. Don't be quick to discredit a story that the patient shares with you just because they have dementia or some other mental impairment. You want to use your own judgment, infer from what they're saying, what you believe to be true, and observe what's going on in that patient's life. Get to know them and observe them so you can piece together the story that they've given you and look for subtle and obvious clues. We talked about those. Look for subtle and obvious clues. And last but not least, if you are so concerned and you do have a strong suspicion, just ask the patient. Ask them very frank. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Reassure them. Let them know that you're there to help. They're in a safe space, and you want to keep that space safe. And they can help you, and you can help them by them helping you. So ask them what's going on. So LBOA, LBOA. Listen, believe, observe, act. And some more specific questions because sometimes people are a little hesitant to pry into individuals' life. I know everyone has a different personality and a different care style. Some people like to really give patients their privacy and don't feel comfortable prying in or asking those questions or don't know where to start. So, a great way to start is just to ask the patient, do you feel safe? This can open up a conversation. This can clue the patient in that you may suspect something is going on. And they may tell you everything that's going on with just those four simple words. Do you feel safe? Another type of question is anyone scaring you or hurting you? Is anything scary going on? Who do you rely on for help? Seeing if they have low social support. What kind of help does that person give you? And make sure you're talking to them about these things in a private area where things can't be overheard by other people. Um, so these are some questions that we can ask the patient if we suspect that they may be falling victim to abuse. And these are some more just for your reference. Do you regularly see friends and family? Do friends and family visit you? Are you concerned about your finances? That's a great one. Are you afraid of anyone in your life? Again, introducing fear and afraid, questioning them about it, that emotion will hopefully resonate with them and impart upon them that you do care, you do suspect something may be going on, and you sincerely want to help them. And that's it for our presentation today, guys. We just have a few review questions. This is our first one of two here. According to research from the National Centers for Elderly Abuse and what we learned about abuser characteristics, which of these individuals best fits the description of an elderly abuser? Would it be the neighbor and friend of 7 years, the husband, the ex-husband, or the unemployed daughter? Who is most likely the abuser of the patient? If all of these people are coming to visit your patient, I'll give you a second here. If you guessed unemployed daughter, you shouldn't have guessed. You should have known that that was the answer because we talked about spouse and adult children are the most likely to be the abusers. And we talked about characteristics of the abuser, unemployed. That was the key word here. I threw husband and ex husband there, but there aren't any descriptions about them. I didn't say ex husband who was in jail, husband who was in jail, husband who lost a job. None of that information was given. So, unemployed daughter was the correct answer here. Question number 2. Stealing a resident's credit card and purchasing things online without their consent is an example of what? Is it A, abuse, B, misappropriation of property, C, exploitation, or D, neglect? If someone stole the resident's credit card and started purchasing things online without their consent, this is an example of misappropriation of property. That's correct. So, just a quick course review. We talked about the differences between abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We covered the rights of each patient. And we also talked about what type of patient is at the highest risk of being abused, and what characteristics point to who is the most likely to abuse a patient. And last, we talked about our different techniques, which are our LBOA, and different specific questions that we can ask patients who we suspect may be falling victim to abuse. I really hope that you guys were able to take some valuable information from today's presentation. Um, I know you did well on our quiz at the end, so you're reassured in the information that you learned. Uh, Again, my name is Deontay Marquis. I'm a family nurse practitioner in Southern California. And I want to thank you for participating in today's presentation, which was brought to you on behalf of myalftraining.com. Thank you and see you again next time.